I've had this strange ability ever since I was a kid. I used to ask my parents about it, but they never seemed to see what I was talking about. No matter who I asked, they always looked at me funny and told me what an overactive imagination I had. None of them seemed to see what I could see, and I quickly learned not to bring it up. It's hard not to bring it up, though, when you're surrounded by it at all times. You see, I could see the connections between people. The people who believed me always asked what it was like, but it's honestly hard to explain. It's not like a string, but that's the closest I can come to describing it. I think of a small, colorful string that's attached to someone else, something unbreakable that ordinary people pass through without interrupting. I learned in high school that there were certain people I had to avoid, because the number of strings attached to them would make my head hurt. There was a girl, one of those super popular girls that every high school seems to have, who almost seemed to glow with the number of strings and cords that came off of her, moving in every direction. She was a glowing ball of reds and greens and blues and yellows and oranges, and if I looked at her for too long, I would develop the worst migraine as I tried to follow all those different strings. The different colors tell you something you need to know about everyone. The red string was for love, but it could also be for infatuation or plain old lust. In high school, I would often use these colors to tell my friends which people liked them, which kicked off many an unwise relationship. Don't get me wrong, a few of them used the information to craft wonderful relationships, even marriages, but it led my friend Tyler to date a girl who went on to stalk him for years to come. Blue strings were for friendship, something that often helped me to find friends and see the connections between others, something I used to make friends with people by befriending their friends. Green was for envy, orange was for hate, yellow was for deception. I used this information to help alleviate some rather hectic situations in my life, and it kept me out of trouble more often than not. As a young person in high school, however, the red string was the one that mattered the most to me. Like all teens, I was a bundle of hormones and emotions that were constantly at odds with each other. I wanted a girlfriend, a companion, someone to be with me and make me feel wanted. I wanted a lover who would sate my sexual desires, something I was always very aware of. Like all adolescents, these desires were often at odds with each other, and sometimes even thwarted each other. Girls who wanted to sleep with me were often put off by my appearance of being clingy. Girls who wanted a relationship were often pushed away by my supposed want of only one thing. I became frustrated, and some of this was spurred on by the fact that I could see these strings. You see, I only approached girls who presented a connection to me by that tried and true red string. The darker the red, the more they usually liked me, and I've watched that string grow lighter and lighter, again and again, before finally falling off as I drive them away with my warring desires. Sometimes I think the strings actually hurt me, making me confident, but also making me aware that I couldn't mess it up. I would stumble into these encounters and ultimately be pushed aside when my behavior or cockiness ultimately drove them away. Until one day, when I woke up and found a heartstring. I told you about the red strings, but the heartstrings were a little different. They were as red as arterial blood, and they only connected people who were meant to be together. Normally, they took time to build, but sometimes you would see two people connected by a heartstring who had yet to meet. When you hear about love at first sight, that's often what they're talking about, but they are extremely rare to find. I woke up one morning, about 2 weeks after my 17th birthday, to find a heartstring leading out of my bedroom. I was confused at first. After the last girl I had clumsily run off with my careless teen advances, she had told the school that I was kind of a creep. Now many of the female students would no longer talk to me. I hadn't even seen a red string in nearly 3 months, so to suddenly wake up with a blood red string was unthinkable. I had no girlfriend. I didn't even have any female friends that would speak to me, and now suddenly I could see this heartstring protruding from my chest, stretching out into the world. It took everything I had to eat some breakfast, get dressed, and shoulder my bag so I could head to school. I just knew it was going to be a great day. I followed the red string on my normal route. I believed it was someone at school, so this seemed the best way to find them. I had no reason to doubt this. School held most of the people my age that I knew. It could be someone new, someone who had been sick and didn't know about the rumors that had circulated, or even someone who found themselves smitten with me despite those rumors. I remember forming a picture of them in my mind, this homunculus becoming an amalgamation of the things I liked in a partner. Green eyes, straight black hair, glasses, maybe a little on the chubby side, an easy smile, and on and on and on. When the string diverted, going towards town instead, I stopped and looked a little anxious. The string was heading into the business district, and I could hear the bell ringing nearby, letting me know that I had about 5 minutes to get to class before I was late. I'd been dragging my feet, daydreaming all the way to school, and the deviation was not something I had planned for. Did I go to school and hope the person was just running late, or did I go looking for what could very well be the love of my life? What if they were only in town for a few hours? What if I missed this chance forever because I was too afraid to break a rule? As the bell for class echoed out, I turned and headed into town. I was already late. It was a little longer. I followed the string up the street, my tennis shoes slapping against the pavement, as I again slipped into a daydream about who I was going to meet. Maybe she was a homeschool girl who was out with her parents. Maybe they were traveling, and our meeting would spark a long-distance relationship that would become something closer later. Maybe, my adolescent mind almost fantasized, it was an older woman who would be taken with me and begin a secret romance. Not too much older, of course. In my mind, she would be 19 or 20, maybe even 21, someone who could take me to parties and concerts and buy me beer as we fell into a whirlwind romance. Teens never think these things through, doing most of their thinking with what's below the belt, and my excitement was building with each step I took. The string led me through the business district, and when it led me towards the industrial park, I stopped and glanced around. Who would be waiting for me here? Was it take your daughter to work day at some factory? If I got caught in there, it would be trouble. Hell, I could have been in trouble for truancy if the officers had caught me walking the streets during school hours. I looked back towards school, thinking it might be time to head back. If I left now, I would only be a little bit late. Only in a little bit of trouble. I might miss first period, but I could still go to my other classes, making up some excuse as to what had taken me so long. I looked towards the smoking factory that lay just across the street, shaking my head as I walked towards it. I would feel at the time that it was an experience too important to miss. I wish now that I had. I might have kept my innocence. I skirted the factory, getting some looks from men with lunch pails and men in ties, but the string didn't lead me there. I walked past a shiny office park, some construction firm or another, but the string led me past that as well. I walked past a concrete plant, a shipping depot, and stopped again as I came even with a long warehouse of unknown purpose. I was looking at a broken and derelict building that had once been a manufacturing plant of some kind for computer parts. The windows were broken eyes that stared out onto the sidewalk, and the doors hung open like the mouth of a waiting carnival funhouse. I didn't want to go into that building, but that was where the string was leading me. I took one hesitant step after another as I approached the husk. I was inside before I started noticing the drops of blood on the floor. The string was trailing the drops like a dutiful hound, and I felt less and less sure that I wanted to know who or where it was taking me. Who would I find in here? Why would they possibly be the love of my life? Was I meant to save them from something? My mind treated me to some sort of hero fantasy, where I would come across my love being menaced by a killer, and know just what to do in order to save her. She would have fled him after he cut her, hence the blood, and I would arrive just in time to save her life, but not before I knocked the villain out with a pipe and proved that I was a real man who could protect her. It's funny, the gymnastics our brains go through sometimes. The blood drops led to a stairwell that went down into the shadowy underbelly of the building. The blood droplets didn't look too bad, maybe a bloody nose or a slight cut, and I took out my phone then and used the light to follow them. I tried to be quiet, but I knew that my footsteps had to be nearly as loud as my breathing, a mixture of ragged fear and hesitant excitement. When I peeked around the edge of the stairwell, I could see hulking machinery that had probably once kept this place running. Generators, old equipment, broken furniture, they all looked like monsters waiting to jump out and get me. But as I stood shivering in that near darkness, I heard something that reminded me of my purpose. A liquid-filled cough came from the back of the basement. I snuck in, my shoes grinding onto sand and broken glass as I made my way towards them. The basement had little windows at street level, and the light that came in illuminated everything but the darker areas. The soup in between the machines was permeable only by my phone light, and I checked them as I went for hiding beasts waiting to ambush me. I heard a wet, racking cough and sped up a little bit, not wanting to be too late to save her in my caution. She was waiting for me, and I didn't want to let her down. She was at the end, her body in a beam of sunlight as she lay dying. She was a mess. Her clothes had been ripped and torn, parts of her on display that had certainly been part of my fantasies, though never like this. She had been about my age, 16 or 17, but I didn't know her. She was leaking blood from dozens of wounds on her face and chest, and her arms looked like ripped open Christmas packages as they hung in bloody tatters. She was leaking other things too, and it was pretty clear that killing her hadn't been enough for him. She looked at me with a mixture of fear and confusion as I approached her, and I told her that I wasn't going to hurt her as I took my phone out and dialed 911. As the operator picked up, though, a shadow fell across us, and I suddenly looked up to see someone looking down from the window at street level. He had clearly placed her here so he could get one more look before leaving, and I saw him in profile now, though the sun made his features hard to make out. He was either an adult or an exceptionally large teen, and he was wearing a ball cap and a jumpsuit that zipped up. There was a logo on the jumpsuit, but I didn't have time to read it before he just took off towards wherever he was going. The operator called out to ask if I was still there, and I quickly gave her my information and told her where I was and what had happened. I gave her the best description of the guy that I could, and when the girl's hand tried to fumble into mine, I took it and squeezed it reassuringly. I wanted to let her know that she had to hold on, she would be important to me, and that she had to stay alive because we had so much more to experience together. In my mind, I could already see her recovery as I stayed by her side, the two of us bonding over her trauma. I would be the man who had saved her, and as she healed, I would be there for her. I'd be by her side when they caught the guy, giving her my strength as she sat in court. We'd be married, we'd have children of our own, and we'd protect them against people like that. And one day we'd grow old together as I looked down and saw the string falling apart, the filaments unraveling as she took her last breath and died in that place. I also saw something I had never seen before, something I would see more often than I wanted to after that day. It was a black string, a midnight cord that seemed to undulate with want, that stretched out the window and to the man who had severed my heartstring. It seemed I had lost my love, but gained something far more intimate. I didn't know what it meant, but that black string filled me with dread. I was still contemplating it when the police arrived. Her name was Adriana. She had been abducted from a neighboring town the day before I found her. He'd been taking her to the warehouse, a spot he knew and often dumped bodies at. The cops said, probably while they'd hoped I wasn't listening, that they had found the bodies of several teenage runaways in that warehouse over the past few years. The fact that they hadn't caught the guy yet really seemed to indicate how seriously they were taking this case. I couldn't help but be a little angry that they weren't doing everything they could to bring this guy to justice, especially given how they had treated me. They questioned me pretty thoroughly. They wanted to know what the killer had looked like, what he had been driving, and most of all, how I had just stumbled across a murder scene. I didn't mention the strings. They'd have likely committed me. Instead, I told them that I had seen someone in a jumpsuit pulling a girl into the warehouse. I had hesitated, unsure of what to do, before sneaking up on the place and following the blood trail to the basement. I had found her when I got to the basement, and that's when the guy had looked in on us. I told them about the jumpsuit with the logo on the breast, but they seemed angry when I told them that the sun had been coming through the window and I hadn't got a good look at his face. They also yelled at me for not calling emergency services right away. They said they could have arrived in time to save her if I'd called them instead of just dithering. My parents arrived about that time, and Dad had some very heated questions for why I was being interrogated like this. I was technically a minor, and the cops were clearly trying to sweat it out of me before someone older and wiser arrived to ask just what they thought they were doing. What exactly it was they were trying to get me to say, I don't know. I suspect at the time they believed I was the killer, but lack of evidence kind of made it hard to prove. The interview wrapped up shortly after that, and Mom went to get the car while Dad said he had to get back to work. I'm proud of you, champ. That took a lot of guts. I'll see you at home later, okay? You can tell us all about it if you want to." He left me on the steps of the police station, Mom off getting the car. That's when I was approached by Miss Histian. That's when I learned Adriana's name. She was almost sheepish, this older woman who looked so much like her daughter. She looked overwhelmed, and who could blame her? She had just lost her daughter in the worst possible way. It was clear, though, that she had stayed for a purpose, and I became a little nervous as she shuffled towards me. She had a heartstring trailing from her, as well as a whole network of blue strings, and she lacked the hatred and jealousy I often saw in my high school. She was loved, well-liked, but the purple caterpillar that inched around her like a leech worried me. Another new color, and I had no more clue what it meant than the black cord I could see moving off into the city. "Excuse me, I was just wondering if you were the one who was with my Adriana at the end." Her words sounded like she was afraid she might offend me. "Yes, ma'am," I said, not sure what to expect next. Did she think Adriana and I had been friends? Did she suspect that I was actually her killer? I felt my body tense like a live wire when she hugged me. I was expecting to feel a knife, to hear a gunshot, but instead I was just wrapped in the warm embrace of this woman I would never get to properly meet now. This could have been my future mother-in-law. This could have been the mistrustful woman who kept an eye on us as we hung out at her house. This could have been the grandmother of my future children. But now, she would be nothing but a thankful stranger, stuck wallowing in her own grief, as I would wallow in mine soon. "Thank you. We might never have found her if it hadn't been for you. She sobbed a little as she tried to get control of herself. "I'm glad that the last face my daughter saw wasn't her killer's. I'm glad that she had someone to comfort her in her final moments." I saw my mom pull up, her eyebrows rising as she got out of the car to see what was going on. Adriana's mother disentangled herself from me, her eyes leaking as she tried to explain herself to my mom. It didn't take much. My mom's kind of a marshmallow, and it wasn't any time before the two were hugging and crying, my mother telling her how sorry she was for her loss. Then we let her get on with her life, saying our goodbyes. Watching her drive away was like watching a new string fall apart that I'd never known I had. I spent the next few days just kind of moping, thinking, wondering what to do now. My parents didn't push. They could clearly see that I was struggling with this, and probably felt it was best to give me some space. I had witnessed something awful, stood in the presence of someone awful, and they thought I was just having trouble with all of it, processing it and making sense of it. That wasn't really it at all. I was mourning for this girl that I had never actually known. I had seen the string. She would have been important to me, perhaps even the love of my life, and I felt a hollow place inside me now that she was gone. Would there be another heartstring for me? Would I ever love again? I found Adriana's body on Wednesday, and I let myself grieve until Sunday night. When I showed up at the breakfast table Monday morning, dressed for school, both my parents seemed surprised. I wasn't, though. On Sunday, I had come to a place where I realized I had two options. I could go on grieving for someone I had never actually known, or I could go on with my life and try to make something of it. 17 was a little early to just give myself over to depression, and the more I mourned for Adriana, the sillier I felt about it. I had no fond memories to look back on, no fights to regret, no dates to feel giddy about, no little moments to reflect on and smile about throughout the day. I couldn't in good faith throw my life away for someone that I'd only known in passing, known that they could have been important to me. I was 17. I had my whole life ahead of me. Dad dropped me off that day, telling me that if anything happened, or if it all became too much somehow, I could call him or Mom and they would come and get me. I think it's pretty brave that you're ready to step back into the real world so soon, but take it slow, okay? I thanked him and stepped out into something unexpected. As I previously told you, I was a bit of a social pariah at school. Lisa Carmichael, the last girl I had really been serious about, had told the school that I was a creep who didn't respect women. I can't honestly say that she was wrong. In my mind, I blamed it on a miscommunication, on a misunderstood signal. But at the end of the day, I had tried to go too fast. I'd been focused on my needs, and I hadn't bothered to listen to a word she had said all night. when she had clearly told me to slow down as we sat in the back seat of my dad's car after our date. I had tried to push it farther, and it ended up with a slap to the face and a departing view of her fleeing skirts. I had deserved the reputation, and had expected to come right back into it. I was greeted instead with whispers and pointed fingers as I walked towards the library, where I usually meet my friends. Strings seemed to attach themselves to me as well. Hesitant blues or pulsing yellows, even a few lighter red strings that throbbed with an almost hopeful heartbeat. I tried to ignore this, not sure what to make of this sudden attention, but it was getting harder and harder to deny that something had shifted. Some of them had even started following me, and when I dipped into the library, I was a little happy to have a door between them and me. Mark and Daniel seemed legitimately surprised to see me when I arrived at school. I guess I couldn't blame them. I hadn't taken a visitor or a phone call or even logged onto my computer in 5 days. They likely thought I was in the hospital or something, and seeing me now had to be a bit of a shock. Daniel exuded his usual blue string, but from Mark, I was getting blue and maybe a little yellow. They were almost neon as they pulsed in and out.
Dude, where the hell have you been?
Yeah, sorry guys. I was, in kind of a bad place after what happened. I can imagine, Daniel said. Mark just shook his head before I could derail his train of thought.
The whole school has been talking about you. You're a legend, man. The stories range from you finding a dead body to saving a girl's life. The rumors about you being a creep are dead. I'm pretty sure most of the girls at school would line up for a chance at you.
That took me a little by surprise. But I didn't save anyone. I just found a body and stayed with her while she I could see her there sometimes when I thought about it, leaned against the brick wall, her clothes shredded, her blood puddling around her, her eyes filled with fear and confusion as she wondered what would happen now that this new player had entered the game. I could still feel the heat draining from her fingers, her strength dwindling as her life left her, and the boneless way her hands slid out of mine. I could still see the string, my tried and true string, fraying and falling apart like cheap yarn. I could still see the bastard in the jumpsuit as he looked down on us, and in my memories, his black silhouette was always broken by a cartoonish smile.
Well, whatever happened, you should capitalize on this. Gabe's having a party on Friday. You should go. It'll be a great way to get past that stuff with Lisa, and maybe meet someone new.
At the time, I gave him a non-committal answer, not really sure I wanted to go. Mark hadn't been exaggerating, though. People approached me all week, some of them teachers, to tell me how brave I had been, or to apologize for how they had treated me. Lisa even attempted to apologize, but I cut her off and told her she had nothing to apologize for. I had been a creep, and the situation had made me reflect on some of my behaviors. She did say she was sorry for spreading the rumors around, and it seemed that I was back on even footing with most of the student body. I began to see a spider web of hopeful red strings, blue strings, and even a few yellow strings from some of my peers. The strings are rarely one color, just as emotions are a spectrum, so the strings I collected were almost always a confusing mishmash of hues. The exception seemed to be the black string. No matter what, no matter how many I've seen over the years, they always stay black. I had never been this connected, this popular before in my life, and as Friday grew closer, I decided I would go to the party. I'm glad I did in retrospect. It gave me a lot to think about. The party at Gabe's house was in full swing when I arrived. His parents were out of town for the weekend, and he was taking full advantage of their absence. It was the usual setup. There were refreshments in the kitchen, music and lounging in the living room, and the upstairs was reserved for couples only. Most everyone from the 12th and 11th grades were there, and even a few underclassmen were mingling. The place looked like a rave as strings were connected and severed and connected anew with such rapidity that it made my eyes hurt. Alcohol seems to complicate matters when dealing with the strings. I'd often see red strings pop in and out of existence at will, and some people went upstairs connected by red, only to come down connected by nothing, or maybe even the orange of hatred. I quickly found a drink and found a corner, trying not to be overwhelmed by the crowd and the light show. People came up to talk to me, but they seemed to understand that I needed my space. They would congratulate me on being so brave, ask how I was doing, and then usually flit back into the mob as I kept my answers short and non-committal. I suddenly felt a bump on my hip and turned to find that Lisa had snuck up on me.
Hey, didn't expect to see you here.
I took a sip, letting her lean with me as we surveyed the party. Yeah, well, Mark made it sound like it was practically mandatory that I show up.
He's out back trying to play beer pong. He's not very good at it, and he gets worse the longer he plays. Hey, do you mind if I stay here with you for a minute?
She seemed tense, something I almost mistook for shyness, but she kept looking back out at the crowd in that way that a trapped animal often does. That's when I saw it. The presence of all those strings had made me miss them, but there were suddenly 2 black strings. One was mine, but one connected Lisa to someone at the party. I still didn't understand what the black strings were, but I'd seen a few of them since Adriana's murder. I'd seen a woman and someone, supposedly her husband, connected by a black string. They were in the grocery store, and though she'd been hanging on his every word, I got the feeling that it was all an act. Her smile never reached her eyes, and sometimes her face became almost predatory as he looked away. I felt like maybe she hated him, but the strings reflected only the deep pulsing black that I didn't have an emotion for yet. The others had just stretched off into the world, the holders just waiting for the opportunity to reel them in and do whatever it was they meant to do. And now, it seemed I'd found another black string, one connecting Lisa to someone. What's wrong? Is someone after you? I asked, scanning the crowd to try and find the other end of the string. She looked nervous again.
After me? What gave you that idea?
Lisa, is someone bothering you? You seem really tense. Lisa looked away. She seemed to be deciding whether to tell me or not. I followed the string into the sea of pulsating lights, and I thought I caught sight of a man at the end of her string. Someone who was mingling with the people at the party. Someone whose height made them stand out a bit. Everyone else seemed to have their mating plumage on display, looking their best so they could find a partner to go upstairs with. But this guy didn't seem interested in any of that. I would see a flash of old jeans, a ripped hoodie, some mud-caked boots. Then he would be back amongst the throng of partygoers, lost in the crowd.
He's friends with Travis, my brother. He sold me drugs a few times, and we hooked up once when I didn't have enough money. We hooked up a few times, actually. But I cut it off with him. I told him never to come near me again. But he saw me, and he's been trying to talk to me. I just keep avoiding him, but...
That was the moment that he finally stepped out of the crowd, and I got a good look at him. The string connected the 2 of them at the navel, and from under his hood, it appeared he had eyes only for her. She seemed to see him noticing her, and stopped talking. He had taken a few steps towards us, when Mark suddenly staggered in front of me, grinning.
You made it. Come on, someone wants you to meet.
He reeked of booze and slurred his words as he led me to the kitchen. I looked back at Lisa as he steered me away. She had tried to follow us, but the hooded man stepped in front of her and blocked her from view. I tried to break away from Mark, but he had dragged me into the kitchen where a chorus of voices rolled over me like a wave, and the swinging kitchen door blocked out the living room. The kitchen was full of people in similar state. They took my sudden appearance as an invitation to bombard me with questions. They called me a hero. They wanted to know about the crime scene. They wanted to know about the girl. They wanted to know what I'd seen. They wanted to know about the killer, and on and on and on. Their drunken questions kept spinning around me like a cloud of bees, and between their questions and the constant pulse of their strings, I was becoming overwhelmed. I had experienced problems with anxiety before, but as they all pressed in, I began to sweat, thinking of Adriana, thinking of Lisa, thinking of the shadowy man, and all the things, and all the colors and feelings as my head pulsed and spun like a merry-go-round. I felt sick, their too sweet breath making a miasma around me, and as I excused myself and fled for the door, I felt like I might throw up, and I didn't want to do it in front of a crowd. Mark moved to intercept me.
What's wrong, dude? Can't hold your liquor?
I felt the cool air on my face, the house party loud enough to rattle the windows. as I tried not to paint Gabe's house in my vomit. That was when I heard a familiar voice.
Let go of me. Let go. I'm not going with you.
I looked around the corner of the house, my legs wobbling as my stomach heaved, and that's when I saw them. The man in the hoodie was dragging Lisa towards his car, Lisa fighting him every step of the way. She was shouting, trying to raise attention from somewhere, but her kidnapper was having none of it. He had a death grip on her wrist, and used his size to his advantage. I stepped towards them, but felt my legs wobble, the anxiety buzzing inside me. It hadn't been like this the last time. I was just a lovesick kid following a string. I was no hero. I was just at the wrong place at the right time. I clung to the house as Lisa tried to pull away, not sure I had the strength to do what needed to be done. So you really are a coward, then? I would hear that voice throughout my life, and though I'd never spoken to her, I knew it was Adriana. You can save her, like you couldn't save me. Doesn't she deserve the life I won't have? That was when Lisa pulled free suddenly, jerking her arm out of his grip and shouting for him to leave her alone. That was when he pulled the knife out of his jacket pocket. I told you, if I can't have you, no one can. The black string between them pulsed and throbbed as they stood staring at each other. It was growing excited as the moment of its completion approached, and that was when I realized what the strings were for. It connected them, drew them together, but its purpose was ultimately to be broken. It would break when he took her life. It would break when he severed the connection. The man had no intention of loving her. He just wanted to make sure that no one else ever would. I ran at him, the moment of his completion seeming to dull his senses. When I hit him around the waist, tackling him against the nearby car, the knife slipped out of his hand. I told Lisa to call the police, and she nodded as she ran towards the house. As she left, the black string began to fray between them, disappearing as the moment of the kill passed. He struggled a little, cursing at me through a mouthful of wet cotton. He was larger than me and probably could have thrown me off if he'd really wanted to, but he'd hit his head when I tackled him, and he seemed kind of out of it. I saw flashing lights and heard sirens coming up the road, followed by the shouts of the partygoers and the general exodus of Gabe's guests. It looked like the party was over. They started to cuff me after separating us, but Lisa told them that it was the guy in the hoodie before he got too far away. He had been trying to stumble off in the confusion, but they got him before he could get too far. They actually thanked me for my help, and Lisa threw a big hug around me as they took our statements.
I'd be dead if it wasn't for you.
I nodded, telling her it was nothing. Looking down, it was only my black string now, coursing off into God knew where. I wondered how long it would be before whoever was on the other end, the man who'd killed Adriana, I suspected, came to settle our score. It's been 2 weeks since the party, and I'm beginning to think that my own time might be getting short. I've had a shadow for the past few days, and it appears that the holder of my string might have found me. I blame the newscast for this, but I can't say I wasn't blameless. I let myself get swept up in my own small celebrity. I got sloppy, and it came back to bite me. It appears I've made myself an easy target. A few days after Gabe's party, I got a call from the local news outlet. They wanted to talk about Adriana's murder, and someone from the police department had leaked my information. I agreed to tell them what I could about it, and they set up a time and a place for the interview. Apparently, the story had really taken off after the interview with Adriana's mother, and the people were curious enough about it for them to squeeze more ratings out of it. I had remained mostly uncommented on by anyone that wasn't at my high school until this point, but that was about to change. My dad let me borrow a suit, since the one I owned was a size too small. As he helped me into the sleek black suit he used for presentations, I felt pretty sharp. This was easily the best I had felt my entire life, and I was still riding the high of helping Lisa at the party. My celebrity at school had soared after that, as word got around that I had stopped her ex from kidnapping her. It seemed that I couldn't walk 2 feet without seeing a red string or an orange string, or a hopeful blue string trying to attach itself to me. I likely looked like the aforementioned popular girl, with my web of connections zipping off in every which way, and I had to stop myself from looking lest I give myself a headache these days. I was on top of the world, and I couldn't see how I could ever come down again. Though, when I saw the black string that stretched off into nowhere, I remembered that there was at least one person out there with less than friendly interests. The interview went about as well as expected. The spin was very positive. Local boy arrives at crime scene in time to comfort dying girl, and the reporter was more than a little flattering. As usual, I didn't mention the strings. I stuck with the same story I had given the police. I had been walking and saw the man dragging a struggling girl from his van into the warehouse. I had been nervous, thinking about calling emergency services, before finding my nerve and plunging into the building to try to help her. I had arrived too late to call for help, and sat with her in her last moments. The news anchor had theatrically wiped her eyes and told me how brave I was. I just sort of nodded and told her that it was nice of her to say so, but I was only doing what anyone should have done in that situation. The interview wrapped up, and as the cameras cut, she thanked me and told me she was sorry for what I had endured. Finding that poor girl like that, I can't imagine how that must haunt you. On that note, she had no idea. A few days later, I saw the van. I believe the first time might have been a coincidence. I was walking home, Mark buzzing in my ear about something, when I saw the van driving in the opposite direction. The windows were tinted, the driver a little more than an outline, but I noticed when he craned his neck around to look at me. I felt a prickle run up my back. He had nearly broken his damn neck trying to get a look at me, but I put it out of my mind. So what? Maybe he recognized me from the news broadcast. It was no big deal. As Mark told me bye, it brought me back to reality. He left for his house and left me to walk the 3 blocks to my own. I hadn't been walking long when I heard a soft voice from nowhere. "You have a shadow." I jumped a little and tried not to look around. Adriana hadn't popped in for a chat since that night with Lisa, and her intrusion was a little worrying. I couldn't honestly believe there was a ghost girl hanging out in my head, but did that make her a manifestation of my own intuition or something? Some kind of Jiminy Cricket conscience voice that lived in my noggin? What was she, and why did she keep popping up? "That van looks familiar, kinda like the one that he pulled me into." I didn't dare look behind me, but I could hear tires driving slowly over pavement. This wasn't real. I had seen a van and just psyched myself out. If I turned around right now, I'd probably just see a mail truck or a taxi pulling up to someone's house. There was no proof that the vehicle behind me was the same van at all. But there wasn't any proof that it wasn't. "I'd cut down this road. He's getting closer." I cut down the alley before I could think about it too much. I heard the vehicle roll on as I sped up, making my way between 2 streets. The alley was too narrow for the van to fit, but I was sure that it would double back and come for me on the adjoining street. I could hear the sound of tires accelerating, and I would likely come out of the alley just in time for them to run me over. I had started to panic when I looked down and saw the very thing that would likely send me over the edge. The black string was rotating, following the course of the van. "Duck behind the dumpster and stay absolutely still." Adriana's whisper was deathly quiet, a pale whisper, and I found myself ducking behind the dumpster before I could stop myself. From my vantage point, I could see it roll past slowly, the driver scouting the alley. I peeked from between the pair of trash cans, waiting for it to pass with slow deliberation. I couldn't see much through the tinted windows, but that black string sticking from the doorway told me all I needed to know. It was no coincidence that he was so close to my house. I would need to take steps to ensure that he never learned where I lived. He had found me, maybe through luck or maybe not, and decided that I needed to be silenced. I stayed hidden there next to that stinking dumpster until I saw him take a left and drive towards Mark's neighborhood. Then I booked it for home as fast as I could. I got home and slammed the door, throwing all the locks before running upstairs. My guardian angel didn't speak up, so I figured I might be in the clear for the time being. I wasn't sure what to do about this, my mind tripping over 1,000 different possibilities. I could tell my parents, but would they believe me? I had no proof that he had done anything, and if the police searched his van and found nothing, it would ruin my credibility. I could go to the police, but that would amount to the same thing as telling my parents. They might also decide that I was looking for attention, or trying to divert them from myself, and decide that I was the real killer. My afternoon became a steady slog between the window and my door, racking my brain for some way out of this. I would check the window, look down on the street for the van, cross to my desk and pick up my notepad, then walk to the door so I could tell my parents before throwing up my hands and doing it all over again. The one person I could have talked to about this was as silent as the grave, which was fitting since that's where she now resided. He let me stew like this for 4 days, until he finally struck. I hadn't seen the van since the first time. but I felt like he was still around. It's hard to explain, but I would get these feelings of eyes watching me, and I would suddenly change my course and walk another way. I cut through people's yards, went to friends' houses only to leave through their backyard, and took roundabout ways so I could get home without being seen. That worked for a few days, but on Thursday, it was raining. Mark's dad had picked him up for a doctor's appointment, but my dad was stuck at work. Mom was getting some things from the market, and I didn't want to stay out in the open waiting for her to come and get me. I started running, kicking up puddles as I went, and by the halfway point I was completely soaked. I kept looking around like a fitful deer, sure that the headlights of a van would find me any minute. I would hear the engine roar suddenly, and the last thing I would see were those headlights and the grill as it rolled over me, silencing me forever. Maybe my mom would find me on her way back from the store. Maybe a passerby would come and hold my hand like I had for Adriana. Either way, I'd be too dead to care. The puddles exploded around my feet like landmines, but I barely noticed as they soaked through my sneakers. I was running flat out, my chest heaving and my heart thumping. My adrenaline was high, and I knew that I just had to make it home before he found me. He had discovered the general vicinity of my neighborhood, and the last thing I wanted to do was lead him right to my house. But it was so wet out, and I just couldn't stay in it for long. When I turned onto my street, my porch light in sight, I thought I was home free. When headlights flooded the other end of the road, the GMC logo standing out on that white panel van, I knew I hadn't. We stood, looking at each other like a pair of duelists. I heard his wheels screech in the deep puddle when I took off running. I was 50 feet from my yard when his tires found purchase. I could feel my sneakers squelching on the pavement, but I put on a burst of speed as his van sped towards me. He was sending up water in buckets, his van plowing down the road like a white bullet. I could see the front porch getting closer and closer, the light glimmering wetly through the pouring rain, but its proximity was no comfort. The van was getting bigger and bigger as it raced towards me, and I was easily 20 feet away as its headlights blazed maliciously. I closed my eyes as my feet sank into the grass of my yard, my foot catching as I stumbled onto the soggy grass. My craggy yard ended up saving my life that day. As I tripped, I rolled across the grass, sliding to a stop on my face. The van drove over the spot I had tripped in a second later, and I heard the screech of tires as he nearly flipped his van on the wet road. He hit the brakes, the car sliding and barely avoiding hitting a tree. As he gained control of his vehicle, he squealed to a stop in the middle of the road, the rain pattering on his van as it steamed. I was dazed, but I kept enough wits to get to my feet and stumble for the door. My keys hung in my pocket, my roar ripping up my throat as I tore my pants getting them out. I could hear his door creaking open, his boots slapping at the turf as he came after me, and I knew that I had seconds to get the door between us. I could see him in my mind's eye, a knife or a piece of wood in his hand, with that sick grin spread across his face, like he always had when I remembered that day. The string would be thrumming between us, seeing its moment at hand as I came within inches of death. I shoved the door open and careened inside, slamming it behind me as I threw every lock I could find. I looked down to see that the string was indeed thrumming, pulsing a midnight tone, as the man beat on the door with his fist. He screamed at me to let him in. He screamed at me to accept my fate. He screamed a lot of things at me as the rain beat down around the house, but I just backed away and reached into my pocket for the phone. I'd call the police and they'd have him. He couldn't hide now. I had him dead to rights, and they couldn't say I was looking for attention when My hand came back empty. I fumbled in my pocket for nearly a minute before seeing it through the big front window and realizing I had lost it in the tumble. My parents had no house phone. No one I knew had a house phone, and I had no way to connect with anyone without my phone. Unless I could get to my computer. If I could get upstairs and message my friends, they could call the cops for me. I looked at the stairs, my legs still aching, and saw the 23 steps as something akin to Everest. My chest hurt, my lungs ached, and my legs had been torn up from the tumble across the yard. I could feel the adrenaline ebbing out, and I didn't feel capable of walking to the couch, let alone up the stairs. Either way, it was the only way I was going to get any help, and I steeled myself for the climb as I took that first step towards the stairs. My adrenaline pushed itself back to the surface when I heard the door to the back porch smash open. It appeared I had less time left than I thought. I shambled up the stairs on all fours, my legs crying out as fresh adrenaline flooded through me. I could hear him cursing as he tried to wrench the door open, and it sounded like he had broken it worse than I'd thought. The back porch was glassed in, all of it shatter-resistant, except for the door. The door was an intricate piece of work my grandfather had made for my parents' wedding. It sounded like he had put a crowbar through it, and was now having trouble getting the ruins open. It was a little sad thinking about it smashed and ruined, my dead grandfather's last great work, but I would mourn its loss later. As I scrambled across the upstairs landing, I heard the door crunch open, and the sound of boots on the linoleum in the kitchen. I crawled into my room and closed the door behind me, moving to the computer as I tried to turn it on. Shaking the mouse got me nowhere, and I had to stop myself from screaming when I realized that it had turned off. I pressed the button, and as it came to life, I strained my ears as I tried to hear the potential killer downstairs. I could hear some voices from below, some stomping around, but it was all muffled by the floor that lay between us. As the computer came on, I pulled up the messenger program on Steam and typed a hasty message to Daniel and Mark. I need help. The man from the basement found me. I need someone to help me. Someone call the police and send them to my house. I watched hopefully, willing one of them to look at their computer or hear the sound from that message, but nothing happened. No one typed, no one saw, no one responded. After about 30 seconds, I was forced to come to terms with the idea that I might be sunk. There was a murder in my house, a man who had murdered many times, and I didn't want to be the latest in a long line of victims. If he caught me in the confines of my bedroom, I'd be dead for sure, and my room did not have the luxury of roof access from the window. As wet as it was, I'd be more likely to slip off the roof and get killed on the lawn after I broke my legs. No, my best option of escape would be out the front door, and I cursed myself for not running for it when I was downstairs. I looked at the door to my bedroom and gritted my teeth. I needed to escape. I crouched low, peeking out the door as I slunk along the railing, listening for the ensuing footsteps of the man downstairs. He was being noisy about his searching, and it sounded like he was destroying my house. He was calling for me, turning over tables and pushing over bookcases. The longer he looked, the madder it seemed to make him. "Come out! Come out, you little worm! I know you're here. Why not come out and take your punishment like a man?" I slunk along, glancing down as I made my way quietly towards the stairs. He had his back to me, looking into the den as he knocked things around, and I was taken back by the wild and untamed look of him. The last time I had seen him, he'd had a ball cap covering his head, and the sun had hidden his features. I had built him up in my mind, making him into some kind of boogeyman. Seeing him from the back, I remember being pretty unimpressed by him, now that I could see him properly. He was balding, his red hair sticking wetly to his head, and his body was slight and bony. He was dressed in the same jumpsuit, the back proclaiming him to be a repairman for some company I'd never heard of. The jumpsuit was saturated, sticking to him and showing me a series of long and frightfully visible bones. He was bird thin, balding, with a crowbar in his hand and a puddle of water growing under his feet. I had begun to get my nerve up, becoming less and less afraid of this walking scarecrow. Then he spoke again. "Where are you hiding? Are you in the kitchen? Are you in the coat closet? I'll find you. I'm going to take my frustrations out on you before I kill you. Maybe I'll break your fingers one at a time. Maybe I'll skin you one piece at a time, starting with your tenderest ones. Maybe I'll give you a taste of what I gave that girl before the end. Keep hiding. I'll find you, you little worm. I have all afternoon to play with you." He had turned as he talked, walking back into the living room, and I felt my flesh crawl as I caught sight of him. Have you ever seen someone who you just knew wasn't right? You see them on the subway, in the grocery store, maybe even right next door. They don't even have to say a word. You just know they aren't right. They have a sweaty look about them, a jittery look. It's like that look tells you their skin is barely containing the horror beneath it. This man had that look, and it told me all I needed to know. If he caught me, there would be no escaping unharmed. He moved into the kitchen, and I heard him shoving things around as he yelled about how he was going to make me watch as he ate my fingers. I moved to the head of the stairs, quiet as a shadow, and started moving my way down as he destroyed the other room. I was trying to be quiet, but I knew that my chances were fleeting if I meant to get to the door. Once I got down the stairs, I could bolt for the door and run out in the rain. If he hadn't destroyed my phone, I could call for help and hopefully have the authorities here before he got away. I was nearly halfway down the stairs when I heard the lock opening on the front door. I glanced out the front window, and my breath hung in my throat. Mom's van was idling in the driveway, and I could see the edge of her grocery bag as she fumbled with the keys. She was opening the door, coming into the last thing she would have expected, and I desperately wanted to call out to her. She was in danger, but I couldn't stop her without giving myself away. She came in while I was dithering on the stairs, calling my name as she closed the door behind her. "Come help with the groceries," she called. When I didn't call down to her, she started looking around. Her face went from placid good-naturedness to confusion as she took in the mess. She was scared, that much was obvious, and she looked around for the source of all the destruction as she called my name again. She didn't think I had done it, but was suddenly worried that something had happened to me. As she put her back to the entrance to the den, though, she missed the danger coming up behind her. I saw him rising from the shadows in the den like a monster, but my throat tightened as I tried to warn her. The crowbar sounded like something tapping a keg as it connected with her skull, and she spilled her groceries as she fell bonelessly to the ground. He leapt on her then, her head oozing slightly, and to my horror he lapped at it like a dog. He was a vicious creature, and as she lay there at his mercy, he looked towards the stairs and caught sight of me. We locked eyes, and I saw him snake his arm around her throat as he watched for my reaction. His grin was the same grin from my nightmares. It was cartoonish and insane, and it was the last thing I wanted directed at me.
"There you are. I don't want to hurt her, but I will. You're the one I want. If you come with me, I promise you that no further harm will come to her."
I didn't believe him, but I didn't want him to hurt my mother either. I came down the stairs telling him I would go with him as long as he didn't hurt her. I made the mistake of watching as he dropped her, and she fell bonelessly back to the floor. That's why I didn't see when he swung the crowbar at my head. One minute I was watching her hit the carpet in the foyer, and the next I was swimming in a sea of black. I would probably have stayed swimming there forever if it hadn't been for a familiar voice calling me back. "You need to wake up." I blinked, but it wasn't really a blink. "Get up, or you'll die." My head felt heavy, muzzy, full of cotton. "This isn't supposed to happen to you. You need to get up. Get up while he's distracted." My eyes flickered, and the dark place was replaced with a shadowy place. I could see lights, soft and undefined, followed by occasional harsh intrusions as they scampered across the ceiling. These lights showed me a familiar space, a nightmare space, that I had visited often in my memories. I wasn't against the same wall that Adriana had occupied. I was in between a pair of generators closer to the stairs, and opposite the wall that I had found her on. If I looked across, I could see a similar alcove made by the old generators, and I suddenly wondered if all of these alcoves had been used to stash his victims. How many others had died in this place? Was I about to be one of them? I struggled, but my hands were tied enough to make my wrists burn. I had returned to the warehouse. I was back in the killing bottle. Of the killer, there was no sign. I could hear road traffic above me and feel the sandy concrete beneath me. My legs weren't tied, but my hands had been cruelly restrained. Whatever he had used to bind my hands dug painfully into my wrists. The more I struggled, the more they seemed to chafe, and I had to stop the urge to yell and give myself away. "You need to hurry," said Adriana's voice in my head. "He won't be gone for long." I wiggled around, looking for some way to get my hands loose. If I could get my hands free, maybe I could surprise him. Maybe I could avoid him. Maybe even get away and go tell somebody. I started rubbing my hands against things, looking for sharp parts, and I was coming up with nothing. The machinery was all smooth metal, the rust flaking off before it could begin to bother my bindings at all. The concrete was too flat, and all the glass on the floor was too small or ground to sand. After a few minutes of struggling around, my fingers felt like they were full of splinters, and my wrists ached from the effort of trying to free myself. I was about to give up when I fumbled against the piece of metal. It made a loud, angry noise when I bumped it, and my fingers went straight to searching for it. It had fallen off something, and the side of it was rusty and jagged. The end had a cruel point on it, and as I worked the edge against my bindings, I felt whatever it was start to part. I had to be careful not to cut myself, but as the sound of that half-crazed voice came closer and began to fill the basement, I stopped caring. I needed to get loose before he came back, and as my blood coated the bindings, my arms getting sliced up in the endeavor, I felt the work become a little easier.
No, I won't tell you where I am. It doesn't matter anyway.
He was coming down the stairs, talking to someone as he descended. I was about 30 feet from the stairs, I judged, and as I sliced at the bindings, I knew I wouldn't have time to hide. He would be on me in a minute, and if I didn't have my hands free, I'd be screwed.
So what if I am? That's just one more reason the therapy isn't working. Maybe I'm killing someone right now. That's just one more failure on your conscience.
I heard the grating of glass as he came to the bottom of the stairs. I felt the ropes slacken a little as I sawed through them.
Oh? Then why haven't you told the police yet? Is it because you know you'd be an accessory to murder? Is it because you know they would ask why you didn't tell them after the first time? Or is it because you know that once my mommy gets me out on bail, I'd come to your house and find your children?
He was getting closer now, his footsteps clomping on the concrete. I gritted my teeth, sawing at my arms slightly as I felt the restraints giving slowly. "Be still," Adriana warned me. I laid back against the machinery, slitting my eyes as I held the piece of metal. His shadow fell over me, and I could feel those eyes as they slid across my body. They were like spider legs on my face, and I dared not move an inch as he inspected me. He took a step towards me then, and through my slitted eyes I could see a knife in his hand. It was a long one, like a butcher's knife, and the blade was rusty red and thick-looking. This was probably what he had used to kill Adriana, what he had used to kill all the people before me, and if he decided to slide it into me now, I was dead. He brought his face very close to mine, and I could smell his crazed sweat as it slid down his skeletal face. I could also hear the voice on the phone that he had pressed against his ear. Whoever was talking to him on the phone was clearly not telling him what he wanted to hear. I could see his face changing from frenzied glee to barely contained rage. When he pulled away, his feet made an angry sound across the concrete. He walked to the end of the aisle and started yelling at them, and that seemed to be the moment of my reprieve. As I sawed, though, I saw the string between us thrumming and pulsating, and realized I didn't have much time left unless I hurried.
Don't you dare. Don't you dare talk to me like that. You couldn't help me. You couldn't cure me. You couldn't stop me. And now these people are dead. This is your fault. You are responsible for this. Your pills and your sessions and your listening didn't help. So what are you gonna do? The only thing you can do is keep listening, keep helping, keep watching me kill as I...
When the bindings parted, I almost dropped the piece of metal in my excitement. I was free. I was loose. What could I do? I was still trapped between this man and my freedom. My eyes were on the string, and as I watched, I saw the thrumming pulse that slid between us. The bead of midnight lit the cord in a soupy glow, and I suddenly realized something very important. The direction of the bead had never changed, but I began to understand that it had been telling me my direction the whole time. I gripped the metal as I rose, slowly, quietly, and crept towards him. He was shouting into the phone, screaming at the speaker as he told them 1,000 different torments he would visit on them. Adriana was silent, a voiceless passenger on my road to salvation, and as the man turned, I was already in mid-swing. Maybe he heard me, maybe he didn't, but his face registered utter surprise as the piece of metal slid into the side of his neck. The phone clattered to the ground, and he coughed blood directly into my face. He fell, red arterial blood flowing from between his fingers as I stood over him. The crazy seemed to be spilling out of him too, and he looked at me with a cloudy sort of understanding. His prey had gotten the better of him, his victim had escaped, and now he was the one looking at death. He reached with a shaky hand for the phone, his hairy digits looking like a fat spider, and I stepped on his hand as I bent down to whisper to him, "The string was never for you. The string was for me. The string knew what I had to do, even if I didn't." His face registered nothing but confusion, and as he died, the black string began to fray and tumble to pieces. It had served its purpose, and now it was gone. The woman on the other end of the phone was shouting for Harold, shouting again and again. but I hung up on her as I used the phone to call emergency services. It was the second body I needed to report in this place, and I knew they would have questions. The police arrived on scene in a matter of minutes. They seemed skeptical about my story almost from the first word. The reporting individual in 2 crimes, both in the same location, was a little hard to explain, but when the officer called in my description and they asked about the Amber Alert, he started to take me a little more seriously. Turned out, Dad had come home a little earlier than expected and found my mother unconscious on the floor and me missing. The signs of a break-in led the police to believe that I had been kidnapped by a burglar, and they had taken my mother to the hospital and started canvassing the city for me. It appeared that I had been found, and with the evidence in the killer's van and on his phone, the case was pretty open and shut. Harold Greer was a 50-year-old trust fund baby, living with his mother and siphoning off her wealth. The van, the jumpsuit, they were all simply smokescreens in order to get into people's houses and find new victims. He had been using this warehouse for decades, and it was only recently that the cops had started finding bodies here. The police estimated that his body count might be in the teens, but they have other remains here that might raise that number into the 30s or 40s. I was given an accommodation by the chief of police for valor, both in finding Adriana and in fending off my killer. They put on a big show of it, and I think the media had given them some flack for thinking I was a suspect. The officers involved did not look pleased, but they ate their crow, and there were no hard feelings about it. People make mistakes, right? Have you ever considered a career in law enforcement? The chief asked, shaking my hand and giving me a grandfatherly smile. You sound like you have the mettle for it. It hadn't crossed my mind before then, but I'm definitely giving it some thought after all of this. For now, though, I'm enjoying a nice, quiet life as a typical high school student. The strings remain, of course, and I still use them to help my friends navigate the pitfalls of high school. I haven't had a black string since that night, but I'm still young, so I'm sure there will be plenty of time for more murder attempts. When I see them, though, I try to keep people away from them as best I can, so they can avoid the fate waiting for them down the line. If I can save people with this gift, it makes me feel a little better about not being able to save Adriana. Of her, I haven't heard a word since that night. Whatever she was looking for, it seems she found it when her killer died. I'm glad the two of us could find our peace.